The Apostles' Circle, Cambridge's secret society and the minds that shaped modern thought. It was a brisk afternoon in Cambridge, sometime in the early 19th century, when a handful of earnest young men, cheeks flushed from the chill outside, and with heavy academic robes swirling about them, converged secretly in a well-appointed room. The soft glow of oil lamps illuminated the gathering, and the faintest murmur of expectation hung in the air. Each man carried a small portfolio of notes or a scrap of paper, for they all had come prepared to hold forth on some philosophical, literary, or theological question that had snagged their intellect in the past week. They were, in many ways, typical of energetic undergraduates at one of the world's oldest universities, yet there was a certain hush, a self-conscious sense of purpose that made them different. They called themselves the Cambridge Conversazione Society, but quietly among themselves they used another name, the Apostles. They were few in number. By tradition, the society never grew large, rarely exceeding a couple of dozen active members. The group's smallness was deliberate. The sense of an intimate circle, carefully chosen, lent an almost conspiratorial aura to the gatherings. Members were drawn primarily from Trinity College and King's College, though over the years men, and later, in a more modern era, women as well, from other colleges found a place among them. From the very start, a hush of secrecy surrounded the Apostles, fueling campus rumor and speculation. The moniker Apostles was reputedly chosen in jest. Originally it was said they had chosen 12 members in conscious echo of the biblical 12, but the name stuck and outlived fleeting attempts to baptize the society differently. In those early years, the society's appetite for moral and philosophical dispute was intense. Religion played a large role in collegiate and national life, and theological controversy overlapped with questions of ethics, society, and politics. In the 1820s and 1830s, Cambridge was in a moment of intellectual stirring. The older, staid traditions of the university were beginning to clash with an age of reform, fresh historical investigations, and the first hints of scientific progress that would challenge established dogmas. The Apostles, meeting in secret and bound by loyalty and youthful passion, found themselves at the crossroads. Here were men who would later distinguish themselves as poets, historians, critics, bishops, philosophers, and statesmen. Among these luminous minds was a certain budding poet named Alfred Tennyson. On an evening that might have been typical of those days, Tennyson, tall and already a presence with his somber manner and deep-set eyes, might have approached his friend Arthur Henry Hallam in the hallway of Trinity. Hallam, who was fated to die tragically young and inspire Tennyson's In Memoriam, was himself an early apostle and had a fiery intellect and a warm humanity. Imagine their conversation, quietly overlapping with the bustling noise of undergraduates hurrying to dinner. "Hallam," Tennyson said softly, "they want me to read those stanzas I've been working on, but I am not sure they're ready." "You're among friends. We'll hear you gladly. Besides, your lines are never ready until you've tested them on the rest of us." "I suppose that's true," Tennyson replied, half smiling. "But the society so often delves into philosophical debates. Do you really think they'll want to hear verse?" "Poetry can be a kind of philosophy," Hallam insisted, "especially in these new times. You must read them, Tennyson. The Apostles will not let you off easily. They'll be quick to critique, but that's precisely why you joined, isn't it?" This storied dynamic, the push and pull between the creative and critical, the personal and the intellectual, was the lifeblood of the Apostles. Their weekly discussions or papers would be introduced by one member. He would read an essay or an excerpt from a work in progress, or simply pose a question. Then, in a round of intense conversation, each member would respond, building on or tearing down the essayist's argument. Through these spirited encounters they forged philosophies, refined works of literature, and tested political ideas. Tennyson's membership in the Apostles was a crucial chapter in his youth. He joined around 1829, meeting a number of bright contemporaries, including not only Hallam but also Richard Monckton Milnes, James Spedding, and others who would shape the intellectual climate of early Victorian England. The Apostles were, in that era, more than an extracurricular club. They were a crucible of new ideas. A friend or critic might have described them as those unbelievably clever, somewhat conceited young men who contrived to discuss everything under the sun in a single sitting. But the apostles took their own seriousness with a dose of affectionate self-mockery, calling themselves apostles but with a wink. They'd cloak their fervour in light-hearted banter, then turn grave if one touched on the deeper questions that animated their minds. Through Tennyson and his friends, the apostles acquired a reputation, albeit a whispered one, for radical thought. It was not that all were political radicals, though some flirted with that description, but rather that they were unafraid to question. Even the fundamentals of Christian theology, which in the Victorian age was a sensitive matter, could be debated behind closed doors. Such open inquiry could rattle the paternal calm of the university authorities, but the apostles' secrecy provided them cover. They wanted to share in the sense of community that came from boundless intellectual exploration, without censure, beyond the constraints of the official lectures and chapel life. When Tennyson read his poetry for the apostles, he was among the first of many men of letters to pass through the society's quietly open door. Indeed, the Cambridge apostles ended up hosting and shaping some of the greatest thinkers of modern times. Their membership would extend to economists like John Maynard Keynes, novelists like E.M. Forster, mathematicians like G.H. Hardy, historians like Eric Hobsbawm, philosophers like G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein, and biographers like Lytton Strachey. Henry Sidgwick, an influential philosopher and moralist, also became one of their key figures in the latter half of the 19th century. Each generation in turn would discover that the society was a lightning rod for new ideas, for fellowship, and for heated disagreements too. To understand the apostles' continuing importance, one must picture Cambridge itself in different eras. In Tennyson's day, Cambridge had not yet fully opened its gates to religious dissenters. Only Anglicans could receive a degree. The newly minted railroads had yet to connect the medieval university town to the rest of Britain. The place was quieter and more insular, with the traditions of formal hall, the regular chapel services, and an unspoken code of decorum that pervaded undergraduate life. Yet, behind the scenes, there was a buzzing curiosity. The Industrial Revolution was gaining steam, quite literally. Romantic poetry had recently flourished, and the seeds of the Victorian age were taking root. The apostles channeled that spirit of inquiry. Decades passed, and with each new wave, the apostles found new controversies to explore. By the turn of the 20th century, Cambridge was becoming a hotbed of advanced mathematical thinking, thanks to figures like G.H. Hardy, who revolutionized pure mathematics. It was also hosting new strains of philosophical thought that would transform British intellectual life. Indeed, by the early 1900s, two men, G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell, would spearhead a philosophical revolution from within these very walls, with the apostles as a discrete forum for their bold ideas. One can imagine a typical meeting in the early 20th century. The custom was for the session to begin late on a Saturday evening, around 9 or 10 o'clock, often continuing well into the night. The host, perhaps someone living in lodgings near Trinity, would clear enough space in his sitting room so that a dozen men could sit in a loose circle. Cigarette or pipe smoke might swirl thickly. There would be tea at the start, or perhaps something stronger for those who liked a glass of sherry. The atmosphere was subdued, yet tinged with anticipation. The evening's essayist would speak. One might see a slender, bespectacled figure with a slightly stooped posture, about to offer a philosophical paper he had spent the better part of a week composing. That figure might have been G.E. Moore, his mind brimming with reflections on the nature of ethical propositions. Moore had joined the apostles at the close of the 19th century, around the same time as Bertrand Russell. Though they were friends, their intellectual collaborations soon blossomed into one of the most significant philosophical partnerships of the modern era. Russell's brilliance lay in logic, in building upon the new forms of mathematics to clarify the structure of reasoning. Moore's brilliance lay in ethical and epistemological precision, carefully disentangling the meaning of good and the nature of knowledge. According to recollections from some members, the apostles were a vital testing ground for Moore's Principia Ethica. The society would gather, hearing Moore read from early drafts, and would pepper him with incisive, relentless questions. Lytton Strachey, flamboyant and witty, might have teased him, but George, he would say, Moore being known to many as George, We simply cannot rest a definition of good on that intangible notion. Where does one find it in the wild? Is it behind the daisies by the cam, or is it locked in your head? He would grin mischievously. More quiet and methodical would respond by analyzing the question. I believe we must admit, he might begin, that good designates a non-natural property. It's not captured by some definitional equivalence. We know it when we reflect upon it, but it cannot be reduced to other qualities. Strachey might roll his eyes in mock exasperation, while Russell, listening intently, would interject with a clarifying statement, referencing the new logic of Gottlob Frege, or the set theories that were swirling around Cambridge at the time. Over time, the Society's minutes, recorded, ironically enough, in a once secret log, would reveal how crucial these closed-door debates were. While on campus, Russell was also beginning to formulate his theories of logic and knowledge, which would lead to his collaboration with Alfred North Whitehead in Principia Mathematica. In The Apostles, Russell's earliest explorations of these ideas were sometimes met with both admiration and skepticism. The group prized bold thinking, but it also demanded clarity. If you could not defend your argument under the cross-examination of the Apostles, you could not defend it anywhere. This tradition of rigorous debate became a hallmark that spanned generations. G. Moore, with his unwavering insistence on precision in ethical and epistemological matters, left an indelible mark, not just on his fellow apostles, but on 20th-century philosophy at large. One might say that the Cambridge school of analytic philosophy, so often traced to Moore and Russell, was nurtured in the warmth, and sometimes the heat, of the apostles' Saturday evening deliberations. It was a precious environment, free from the constraints of formal lectures or published criticism, in which ideas could be tested without censure. Enter Ludwig Wittgenstein, a slightly later figure in this same philosophical circle. Though Wittgenstein was originally Viennese, he came to Cambridge to study under Russell before World War I, and eventually, though not at once, joined the Apostles. If one imagines Wittgenstein at an Apostles meeting, the image is of a formidable presence, thin, intense, pacing at times, or sitting with fingers pressed to his temples. He was not the sort of man to adopt a polite, measured tone in debate. Instead, he might erupt in passionate outbursts, vehemently challenging the logic of others. "No, no, that is nonsense," he might exclaim in his Austrian accent. "You do not understand the grammar of the language we use." And there would be startled laughter or angry retorts. Yet for all his brusqueness, Wittgenstein was revered. Indeed, the Apostles had a tradition of forging a sense of brotherhood that transcended differences in nationality, personality, or perspective, though it did not always quell the friction that came with strong opinions. From those nights came the seeds of works like the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Wittgenstein's first masterpiece. And as with Moore and Russell, the reception of his ideas among the Apostles was varied. Some found him brilliant but baffling. Others, like Keynes, recognized in Wittgenstein an awe-inspiring genius, but lamented his occasional hostility to more ordinary forms of conversation. And Wittgenstein himself, unsettled by the world, by war, and by the demands of philosophical perfection, sometimes withdrew from Cambridge altogether. Still, he remained intimately tied to that small circle of minds, who week after week tested arguments and offered companionship in the chilly nights by the river Cam. John Maynard Keynes was arguably one of the Apostles' most famous 20th-century members, though his primary achievements lay not in philosophy but in economics. Keynes had an unusual vantage on the group's tradition. He joined as a young student at King's around 1903 and quickly became a leading light. The Society's open-minded, discursive environment provided a space for him to develop his formidable intellect beyond the standard curriculum. It was often said that the Apostles gave Keynes the confidence and the background in philosophical analysis that later shaped his revolutionary approach to economic theory. Keynes once remarked in a letter to a fellow apostle that the Society functioned as the inmost sanctuary of his life in Cambridge, a place where one's ideas could be recognized and tested at the highest level of sophistication. One can imagine him after a meeting, buttoning up his overcoat at the door, turning to a friend, perhaps Lytton Strachey or E.M. Forster, and saying, "That was a capital discussion. though if we keep spending half the night debating More's definition of good, I may never finish my notes on probability. In that half-jesting remark lies the spirit of the apostles. They were engaged in multiple lines of inquiry, from the nature of moral value to the intricacies of mathematical logic and beyond. Keynes himself grew from a young mathematician into the economist who would reshape policy-making during the Great Depression and World War II. Yet he never lost that sense of wonder for fundamental questions, nor the introspective style of analysis that the apostles honed. It should be said that the apostles were not all philosophy and economics. The group's scope was broad from the outset. Henry Sidgwick, for instance, had been one of the most important moral philosophers of the late 19th century, known for his methods of ethics and his broad influence in shaping Cambridge's approach to the moral sciences. Sidgwick was also deeply involved in the movement to broaden educational opportunities for women, leading to the foundation of Newnham College in Cambridge. Within the apostles, Sidgwick represented a pivot from the older Victorian tradition of philosophical theology to a more systematic moral philosophy. He approached ethics with the same calm clarity that others would bring to logic. This bridging of traditions, religious and secular, Victorian and modern, was characteristic of the apostles at the turn of the century, who found in Sidgwick a wise, somewhat paternal figure. He was said to speak gently but incisively in debates, to such an extent that younger members often tried to anticipate his objections in advance. Indeed, an anecdote circulated about how Sidgwick once, in a mild voice, pointed out a contradiction in a fellow's argument, and then looked genuinely pained at having to do so. It was that combination of empathy and intellectual rigor that made him beloved within the group. Meanwhile, the apostles also drew in men of letters, such as E.M. Forster and Lytton Strachey. Forster was known for his novels, A Room with a View, Howard's End, A Passage to India, each revealing a nuanced examination of social mores and personal relationships. His participation in the apostles reflected a broader cultural movement, the bridging of literary sensibilities with philosophical and political inquiry. Forster was a thoughtful contributor to the Society's evenings, sometimes reading from manuscripts or sharing sketches of characters he was developing. He found that the apostles were a safe place to explore ideas about class, gender, empire, and personal identity, topics that might otherwise have drawn censure in Edwardian England. It's said that Forster's experiences among the apostles helped embolden him to speak more openly about personal matters as well, including his closeted homosexuality, which was quietly recognized among his Cambridge circle. As for Lytton Strachey, he was perhaps the wittiest among them, a man whose pointed epigrams and irreverent approach to biography would later scandalize the literary establishment. In the apostles, Strachey found a group that relished bold departures from conventional thought. He famously teased G.E. Moore and called him a saint, with a sly grin, ironically referencing More's austere moral approach. The question of how to reconcile More's absolute moral truths with the complexities of lived experience was a topic Strachey, Forster, and Keynes explored in letters among themselves. Strachey's Eminent Victorians, published in 1918, owes some of its critical verve to the environment of the apostles, where deflating pomp and challenging orthodoxies was par for the course. It's easy to imagine him reading early sketches to the group, while the smoke from the fireplace curled around them, and a hush of both alarm and delight settled over the room. This same circle would eventually become part of the Bloomsbury Group in London, a constellation of artists, writers, and thinkers that included Virginia Woolf, sister of the apostle Adrian Stephen, and others. Indeed, the apostles functioned as one important root of Bloomsbury. The social connections formed in Cambridge fed directly into the gatherings and salons of Gordon Square in London. There, men and women, now no longer bound by the male-only traditions of the university, continued the same style of conversation, often raucous, provocative, intimately personal, that had been forged in the cloistered rooms of Trinity. Despite their closeness, there were frequent disagreements, intellectual and personal. Some of these were famously intense. Consider the friction between Wittgenstein and nearly everyone else at one point or another, or the debates over pacifism during World War I and World War II. Keynes himself ended up working for the British government, while some others, like the older Bertrand Russell, took pacifist stances in the First World War. The Society, being a forum for free discourse, witnessed these conflicts in microcosm, as members found themselves on opposing sides of moral or political questions, yet the bonds of affection often endured. Another realm of apostolic influence was mathematics, as seen in the presence of G.H. Hardy. Hardy was known for his pioneering work in number theory, collaborating famously with the Indian mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan. Although mathematics might seem far from the literary or philosophical preoccupations of many apostles, Hardy himself described a certain aesthetic in pure mathematics that aligned surprisingly well with the society's interest in beauty and truth. According to anecdotes, Hardy occasionally read short expositions of mathematical proofs to the apostles, not to teach them the details, but to illustrate the intellectual elegance underlying them. His restless intellect and his wide-ranging curiosity were entirely at home among the apostles, who prided themselves on bridging disciplines. The society's broad sweep of interests extended to history too. Eric Hobsbawm, one of the most influential Marxist historians of the 20th century, was a later apostle. He joined at a time when radical politics were swirling around Cambridge. This was in the 1930s and 1940s, when the spectre of fascism in Europe and the popularity of Marxist thought among some undergraduates created a charged environment. The apostles never officially endorsed any one political ideology, but they valued rigorous debate and fearless inquiry, and so Hobsbawm found fertile ground for his developing ideas on the nature of capitalism, class struggle, and historical transformation. It's easy to envision him in a post-war meeting, perhaps in the late 1940s, vigorously challenging a more conservative member who tried to defend the status quo of British imperial interests. "But you must see," Hobsbawm might exclaim, "that the forces of history do not yield to moral platitudes. We must look at economic relationships and the clash of classes." Such declarations would have either exasperated or electrified the group. True to form, the apostles would not shrink from the controversy. As the 20th century progressed, the apostles continued to meet, always upholding traditions of secrecy, selection, and intense discussion. They still met on Saturday nights, forming that invisible chain that connected Tennyson's era to the modern world. Inevitably, old feuds and new controversies arose. One significant episode in the mid-20th century was the infiltration of intelligence by some Cambridge graduates, Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, and Kim Philby, who were recruited by the Soviets. While not all of them were apostles, as is sometimes incorrectly rumored, Blunt was, Burgess was, but Maclean and Philby were not. The sense of secrecy and the left-wing sympathies at Cambridge in the 1930s contributed to the rumor that the apostles were a pipeline for espionage. In reality, the society's secrecy was not primarily political, but it did foster intense loyalty and closeness, and it's true that some apostles were deeply left-wing. This era cast a shadow over the group for a time, as intelligence services and the national press probed the details of who knew what and who might have passed sensitive information. The society, reeling from unwelcome attention, turned further inward, determined to preserve its tradition of private discourse. Throughout these upheavals, the apostles retained their essential character, a small, carefully chosen group devoted to debate, reflection, and fellowship. Over cups of tea or glasses of sherry, over the smoke of pipes or cigarettes, they wrestled with the moral, aesthetic, political, and metaphysical questions of the day. One of the great fascinations of the apostles is that each generation in its turn saw the group as both radical and deeply traditional. Radical because behind closed doors nothing was taboo to discuss, and traditional because it looked back on the lineage of Tennyson, Hallam, Moore, and Russell with reverence. They carried forward the intangible sense that to be an apostle was to belong to an intellectual aristocracy, a realm of conversation that soared above the mundane concerns of daily Cambridge life. It would be instructive to linger a moment on the daily texture of Cambridge, for that set the background. By the early and mid-20th century, Cambridge was far more bustling than in Tennyson's time, with better rail connections, new laboratories, and an evolving student body. Colleges were still single-sex for the most part. Women's colleges had been established, but men and women were usually taught in separate enclaves. Undergraduates typically wore gowns to dinner, and many were subject to a formal set of chapel attendances, though the religious strictures had loosened significantly since the mid-19th century. Lectures by people like Russell, Moore, and later Wittgenstein, when he returned to Cambridge after his sojourns in Austria and elsewhere, could draw crowds of eager students. And behind it all, on Saturday nights, if you were invited, you might find yourself at the threshold of a certain undergraduate's rooms, giving a password or a nod to confirm your membership, then climbing the creaking stair to a smoke-filled sanctuary where a half-dozen or more keen faces turned to greet you. Even in the 1970s and beyond, as new social movements reshaped Britain, the apostles persisted. Women were finally admitted to full membership in 1979, reflecting broader changes in the university's fabric. The secret society, however, remained as elusive as ever, with many a rumour swirling around the identity of its members or the nature of their ceremonies. By that point, the apostles had become a topic of academic curiosity in its own right. Historians and journalists tried to piece together membership lists, though official records were often incomplete or jealously guarded. The group's mystique continued to feed speculation about how these private debates might have influenced public policy, literature, or academic thought in unexpected ways. Looking back across this whole tapestry, one finds a number of fascinating through lines. Disagreement was a constant. The society's structure encouraged it, for one joined to have one's ideas challenged, not coddled. A second constant was friendship, a deep kind of intellectual camaraderie that bound Tennyson to Hallam, that bound Russell to Moore and Wittgenstein, that bound Keynes to Strachey and Forster, and in later years that bound Hobsbawm to the other historians and thinkers of his generation. Out of that friendship sprang some of the most important intellectual currents in modern thought: the Bloomsbury group in literature and the arts, analytic philosophy, Keynesian economics, the moral philosophy of Sidgwick, the historical scholarship of Hobsbawm, the mathematical breakthroughs of Hardy. The apostles were seldom the sole or even the largest impetus for these achievements, but they were the crucible in which many of these minds were first tested and encouraged. Consider now the strong personalities that occasionally clashed. For instance, Bertrand, Russell, and Wittgenstein, though joined in a master-pupil relationship and both apostles, had frequent disputes over the nature of logic and language. Russell admired Wittgenstein's intellect but could be exasperated by his mercurial temperament. Wittgenstein, for his part, occasionally dismissed Russell's philosophical problems as trivial or misguided. Another example, Lytton Strachey and some of the more traditional Christian members of the society might have locked horns over religious sincerity or moral constraints, especially if Strachey's irreverent wit led him to mock revered institutions. Yet these tensions did not tear the society apart, rather they gave it energy. The apostles believed that only through rigorous challenge could one refine or discard an idea. Sometimes a younger member might challenge an older one in a manner that seemed impudent, but the society had no official hierarchy during discussions, only the hierarchy of intellectual merit, so to speak. A particularly piquant disagreement might be conjured in the 1920s, just after the First World War, when Keynes's ideas about international finance and reparations for Germany were causing a stir in broader politics. He had written The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which excoriated the terms imposed on Germany at the Treaty of Versailles. Suppose Keynes read excerpts of his arguments to the apostles on a given Saturday night, expecting support from his like-minded liberal friends. Instead, imagine he faced a critique from a more traditional or patriotic member who believed that Germany should indeed bear the heaviest costs for the war. The discussion might veer into moral territory. Is it not just, the contrarian might say, to demand from Germany the full measure of accountability? Then Keynes would retort, justice that punishes Germany's economy so harshly will sow the seeds of future conflict. We must look to the broader consequences. The rest of the group, Strachey, Forster, and perhaps a mathematically minded sort like Russell, would weigh in, each with a unique perspective. With a typical dryness, Russell might say, I should prefer we impose reparation on the authors of propaganda rather than the entire populace. And from these somewhat playful, somewhat urgent arguments, a deeper understanding would emerge. Many members of the apostles carried these habits of mind, this willingness to question, to refine, to doubt, into their later professional and creative work. Tennyson's poetry has that reflective, searching quality, especially in In Memoriam, which contemplates loss, faith, and the human condition with a philosophical bent, that might have been nurtured in the early debates with his peers. More's Principia Ethica shaped an entire generation's approach to moral philosophy, including those in the Bloomsbury group who interpreted More's ideals to champion personal relationships and aesthetic experience. Russell's logic and Wittgenstein's language philosophy continue to undergird huge swaths of analytic philosophy. Keynes' The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money redefined economics in the 20th century. Forster's novels remain among the most celebrated in English literature, prizing human connection and the transcending of social barriers. Hardy's mathematics soared to new heights of abstraction, an approach that still resonates in number theory. Hobsbawm's sweeping histories set the agenda for understanding capitalism, revolution, and the modern era. One could plausibly trace at least a hint of each major work's genesis back to the boisterous, smoke-filled evenings in some set of rooms in Trinity or King's, where the apostles demanded clarity and vision. Henry Sidgwick stands as a figure bridging the old and the new, embodying the moral seriousness of the Victorians while encouraging a transition to a more secular, rationalist Cambridge. His presence in the Apostles reminds us that the society was not only the domain of the flamboyant or the rebellious, it was also a place for reflective and methodical thinkers who wanted to reconcile old virtues with new truths. Sidgwick's mild manner belied a formidable intellect, and members who came in contact with him often spoke of him in reverential tones, describing how he would calmly pick apart a shaky argument until nothing remained. Such thoroughness was a hallmark of the Apostles. No idea was sacrosanct, no tradition beyond scrutiny. In the swirl of these debates, one must not forget that the Apostles were also a social club, albeit a serious-minded one. Members formed friendships, travelled together, supported each other during personal crises, and sometimes formed romantic attachments too. In an era when homosexuality was criminalized, the Apostles provided for some a rare space of acceptance or at least tolerance. That dimension of fellowship, the ability to speak intimately about one's personal life as well as one's intellectual life, created a strong bond. E.M. Forster later wrote with gratitude about that sense of acceptance. Lytton Strachey also found in the Apostles a place to cultivate the persona he would later unleash more publicly. The story of the Cambridge Apostles is in many ways the story of modern intellectual Britain. From the early Victorian phase, represented by Tennyson, to the High Modernist era, represented by Russell, More and Keynes, right through to the post-war intellectual landscape with Hobsbawm and others, the Apostles were at the centre of shifting cultural and academic tides. The society's continuity is remarkable. It was never swallowed up by the myriad clubs and societies that have proliferated at the university, nor was it undone by the controversies that occasionally shook its membership. The vow of secrecy, the emphasis on smallness and intimacy, the willingness to cross-examine each other's most cherished beliefs, these features remained stable over nearly 2 centuries. What then might a typical Apostles meeting have looked like in, say, the 1950s or 1960s, when Hobsbawm was around? The form remained much the same. A paper would be presented, the group would challenge it, discussion would last for hours. Afterwards there might be a light supper, a tradition sometimes called refreshments, which could include bread, cheese, perhaps fruit, and an assortment of drinks. Then members might linger, drifting into smaller conversations in side rooms or the corridor, continuing the argument more casually. Some might retire to the local pub if the hour was not too late, or else they might return to their rooms, heads spinning with new ideas. And the next morning, they would wake to the routine of Cambridge lectures, supervisions and tutorials, all the while carrying the afterglow of the previous night's debate. In retelling this long history, one sees how each generation of apostles was shaped by the intellectual currents of its time. Tennyson and his cohort wrestled with romanticism, theology, and the new historical consciousness that would bloom in Victorian thought. The generation of Sidgwick and Hardy saw the rise of rigorous moral philosophy and pure mathematics. Russell, More, and Wittgenstein's generation propelled analytic philosophy and early modernist aesthetics. Keynes, Forster, and Strachey overlapped with them, bringing in economics, literary innovation, and cultural criticism. Hobsbawm and the mid-20th century apostles grappled with Marxism, totalitarianism, and the aftershocks of 2 world wars. But despite all these changing preoccupations, the Society's format of earnest, open-ended debate persisted. That format demanded a kind of personal courage. One had to be prepared to have one's mind changed, or to stand firm against withering critique. Now and again, the Apostles' influence on the outside world became very tangible. When Keynes went to the Versailles Peace Conference, for instance, or later to the Bretton Woods negotiations, he carried with him not just his formal training in economics, but the rhetorical and analytical style he had developed in part among the Apostles. Russell, in campaigning for nuclear disarmament and radical social reforms, used his formidable powers of logic and argumentation, honed in countless evenings of debate. Forster's humanistic voice, so crucial in the defense of liberal values and personal freedoms, can be traced to the sympathetic but uncompromising dialogues he partook in at Cambridge. The entire Bloomsbury ethos, emphasizing authenticity, personal relationships, and freedom from Victorian constraints, grew out of the moral and aesthetic inquiries advanced by More and tested among the Apostles. Of course, not every member went on to public renown. Many Apostles were content to remain in academic life, or in the church, or in private careers, yet they all shared that intangible bond. They read the same minutes, laughed at the same inside jokes, teased each other with the same affectionate nickname for the Society or the Apostles. They took pride in the notion that membership conferred an ongoing identity, a lifelong membership of sorts, even if they rarely attended as older men, or, eventually, women. It is worth underscoring that, despite the focus here on famous names, the Apostles was never simply a list of luminaries. It was a living, breathing collective, fueled by the diverse personalities that stepped through its doors. Early on, it drew from theology and poetry, later from philosophy and mathematics, eventually from politics, economics, literature, and history. Each discipline made its mark. Disagreements ranged from profound theoretical divisions to mundane quarrels about the length of someone's paper or the pungency of someone's pipe tobacco. Personal friendships were formed and sometimes broken. Yet the Society endured, carrying forward a tradition of intellectual seriousness coupled with camaraderie, a spirit that many an undergraduate at Cambridge, hearing rumours of the Society, might secretly covet. Throughout its existence, the Apostles cultivated a sort of Socratic ethic. The truth emerged, if it emerged at all, through dialogue. No monologue or single treatise could suffice. That's why an evening might end inconclusively, with more questions than answers. But that was precisely the point, to sharpen minds against each other. In the 1830s, Tennyson and Hallam used the Society to refine their conceptions of poetry, friendship, and the meaning of life in a post-romantic world. A century later, More and Russell used it to refine logic and moral theory in a post-Kantian, post-Hegelian world. Still later, Keynes used it to develop new frameworks for understanding economic booms and busts, and Forster used it to develop a literary ethic of human connection in a world riven by class barriers. If there was a single guiding principle behind the Apostles, it was the conviction that open-minded, critical, and honest conversation, however spirited or discomforting, was essential to intellectual progress and moral understanding. Let us return then to Alfred Tennyson in his youth, reading out a fledgling poem on that cold lamplit evening. Perhaps he noticed the hush that fell when he finished the final line, the flickering lamplight illuminating the attentive faces of his fellow apostles. Arthur Hallam might have been the first to speak, offering gentle praise, while another might suggest a revision or question a particular metaphor. Tennyson, absorbing these reactions, would carry them back to his solitary hours of writing, eventually forging the verses that would come to define an era. In that moment, one can glimpse the embryonic spirit of the Apostles, a small gathering, half hidden from public view, quietly shaping the future of English letters, and, as later members would show, the future of economics, mathematics, philosophy, and more. This was how the Cambridge Apostles first stirred, and how they continued to stir, century after century, in the venerable cloisters and modern lecture halls alike. As the decades moved on and the Society's membership blossomed, one can envision John Maynard Keynes in the 1920s, stepping onto the dais in a dimly lit room and announcing in a clipped, confident tone, Gentlemen, this evening I should like to discuss a question of probability, which has been weighing on my mind. I propose that the standard treatments are insufficiently attentive to the subjective element. He would pause as smoke drifted lazily across the circle, scanning the keen, expectant faces. Across from him, a gaunt, intense figure, Wittgenstein, might clench his fists, bracing himself to interject with a fierce objection. Russell, arms folded, would observe carefully, waiting to see whether Wittgenstein or Keynes would produce the more cogent argument. E.M. Forster, sipping tea in the corner, might be quietly listening, prepared to weave his own reflections on human experience into the conversation. Lytton Strachey would be half smiling, ready with a barb should the discussion slip into pomposity. G.E. Moore, with eyebrows furrowed, would calmly ask a clarifying question about the nature of probability statements. Meanwhile, G.H. Hardy, if present, might weigh in with a wry note about the difference between the rigor of mathematics and the uncertainties of the social sciences. Later, after the formal discussion ended, the group might wander into an anteroom for supper and continue the conversation in smaller clusters, the talk drifting to personal matters, gossip, or the latest campus rumor, forming the intangible tapestry that made up an apostles' evening. Another evening, set in the 1930s or 40s, would find a young Eric Hobsbawm introducing his nascent ideas about the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th century, weaving historical data with Marxist theory. Perhaps an older member, suspicious of political dogmas, would push back. "Is not your analysis ignoring the role of individual agency, Mr. Hobsbawm?" might come the question. And so the debate would spiral on, late into the night, forging the historian's arguments into the sharper form that would eventually captivate readers worldwide in his age of series. Through all these vignettes, we see how the apostles served not just as a society, but as a dynamic workshop for ideas. The legends that swirl around the society, that it was a conspiratorial clique, that it harbored spies, that it shaped the Bloomsbury set, that it produced daring philosophers, each contain a kernel of truth, though sometimes exaggerated by rumor. The real heart of the apostles has always been smaller, quieter, and more intimate than those legends imply, a handful of bright minds sitting in a room, testing each other's ideas, forging an unspoken bond of trust. Eventually, as times changed, the apostles had to adjust to new norms. By the late 20th century, women were admitted, reflecting the broader transformation of the university. The society's minute books, once compiled in careful handwriting by each generation, might now be typed or recorded in digital formats, but they remain inaccessible to the general public. For all that times have changed, the society's sense of tradition, secrecy, and exclusivity persists. In an era of social media oversharing, the apostles' hush might seem an anachronism, but perhaps that hush is precisely what preserves the society's capacity for free-ranging discussion, a sanctuary from the glare of public scrutiny. And so the Cambridge apostles continue in their idiosyncratic way, bridging centuries. The chain that began with a small group of earnest, curious undergraduates in the 1820s endures through new generations, each meeting in candlelit or lamplit rooms, continuing the conversation that Tennyson, Hallam, and their contemporaries began. The membership roster reads like an honor roll of British and European intellectuals, yet the fundamental principle has remained the same, a close-knit circle devoted to argument, friendship, and the pursuit of ideas. They do not claim to have final answers. If anything, they take pride in the pursuit itself. As Henry Sidgwick might have put it in a mild yet firm tone, "We are here to inquire, not to arrive at dogma." One can only imagine what the next century of apostles' debates will bring, or who will emerge from the society's hush to reshape our world. Perhaps a new generation of mathematicians, philosophers, economists, novelists, and historians is already honing their minds in those shadowy gatherings. Perhaps there is a future Tennyson reading lines of verse that will speak to the 22nd century, or a new Keynes forming an economic theory that will guide us through crises yet unforeseen. The apostles' gift to the wider culture has been precisely that synergy of personalities, eclectic, brilliant, and unafraid, who dare to challenge both themselves and their times. Even in their disagreements, they have forged the tools of critical thought, creativity, and moral inquiry that enable us to see the world anew. And at the root of it all, beneath the spires of Cambridge, beside the ancient courts and across the gentle water of the Cam, lies the society's simple essence, the power of conversation. For these men and women believed that if a group of engaged, curious minds gather in good faith and under a promise of confidentiality, then the conversation can go deeper and the challenges can be sharper. They believed that out of such gatherings, truths, and sometimes illusions, can be better understood. The fractious, opinionated apostles, with all their differences, displayed a faith of sorts, a faith in the generative magic that occurs when kindred spirits confront each other's ideas and hold nothing back. In the end, to recount the intellectual history of the Cambridge apostles is to trace the interplay between remarkable individuals and a unique communal setting. Alfred Tennyson, searching for the meaning of friendship and loss, found in the apostles a testing ground for the poetic voice that would define the Victorian age. John Maynard Keynes, straddling mathematics and economics, found there an environment that sharpened his capacity for radical thought, eventually rewriting the rules of government intervention in the economy. Forster found a safe place to explore the complexities of human relationships and to refine the empathetic eye that makes his fiction so enduring. Hardy saw in the society a place where abstraction could be appreciated, unencumbered by utilitarian demands. Eric Hobsbawm discovered an audience for his bold, Marxist-influenced view of history. Moore, Bertrand Russell, and Ludwig Wittgenstein each, in turn, harnessed the fierce dialectic of the apostles to craft the foundations of analytic philosophy. Lytton Strachey's irreverent wit sharpened itself on the society's sometimes solemn seriousness, producing a new form of biography that challenged Victorian pretensions. Henry Sidgwick laid down a moral and educational legacy that still resonates, bridging religious and secular thought. Each of these luminaries, and many more besides, called themselves apostles. And so, the story continues. Long after Tennyson's voice fell silent, those closed doors at Cambridge remain shut to prying eyes and ears, but behind them the conversation goes on. The Cambridge apostles have never sought publicity, have never marched under a banner, and have never expanded into a large society that courts membership. Their legacy is more subtle but no less profound, a legacy of thinking that is both personal and collective, both playful and exacting, both reverential of tradition and iconoclastic. It is a legacy that, through a curious blend of secrecy and openness, has left an unmistakable imprint on modern thought. And if one imagines an idealized final scene, it might take place late at night, in some high-ceilinged set of rooms overlooking a moonlit courtyard. An undergraduate, unnamed, but possessed of a spark of brilliance, fidgets nervously with a sheaf of notes. Around them, the other apostles wait, sipping tea or leaning back in antique chairs, their faces partly in shadow. The hush descends. The essayist clears their throat and begins, "I propose to explore a question." The circle listens, and so once more, the ancient dance of inquiry begins, each voice challenging or encouraging, forging a fleeting but essential moment in the unbroken chain that is the Cambridge apostles.